Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. After the events of the last few years, it's nice to be able to deliver this talk to you in person. And welcome also to everybody who's joining us on Zoom. Last year, I did a talk about several Chinese immigrants who had restaurants in Auckland that served Western food. When I started this project, I totally didn't expect to find this aspect of Chinese restaurant history, but it turned out to be a fascinating look into a different, untold side of the New Zealand Chinese experience. And you can catch up online with that talk. The next step in the evolution of Chinese restaurants in this country was restaurants serving Chinese cuisine to Chinese customers. When I say the word Chinatown, what do you picture? It's this, isn't it? Well, this was Wellington's Chinatown. So in the New Zealand context, there are questions as to whether we should even use the word Chinatown. But I have no problem with it because there were areas where Chinese residents and businesses grouped together. And in these neighbourhoods, they were able to maintain their Chinese way of life. I'm showing this picture of an overseas Chinatown to reinforce the stereotypes of Chinatown, because I'm going to use it to make a point later too. So, during the Goldfields era, Dunedin and Greymouth were the towns where the boats arrived, and the Chinese miners were constantly moving through. In Dunedin and Greymouth, they could get organised, get information about where they were going, buy provisions, or maybe were leaving New Zealand. And in a situation like this, it's very important to be able to buy a meal, whether you're passing through for the day or lodging in town for longer. We know for certain of a dozen small restaurants serving Chinese food to Chinese customers in Dunedin in the period 1876 to 1910. And then, when the gold mining ends, the Chinese restaurants just disappear. And as the New Zealand Chinese choose to live in Wellington and Auckland, where there are more opportunities, suddenly Chinese restaurants start opening there. This is a photo of Haining Street, the heart of Wellington's Chinatown. The first definitive evidence we have of a Chinese restaurant here is from 1910. But in this photo, some of the buildings are restaurants, but you wouldn't know it. Nothing in the design to indicate it's a restaurant, no signs. That's because the Chinese community knew where the restaurants were. In Auckland, we see a clear pattern of Chinese choosing to live together. You could even call it the development of a Chinatown. Historians think the first Chinese market gardens in Auckland were established in 1866. And we know that the rich soils around Kaiba Pass Road and in the Domain were the first confirmed sites of Chinese market gardens. These locations were still semi-rural at the time. By the 1920s, there were Chinese market gardens in Northcote, Takapuna, Avondale, Mount Roskill, Mangere, Onehunga, and the western bank of the Tamaki River. In the period from 1890 to 1920, only about half of Auckland's Chinese community worked on market gardens in the burbs. So what did the other half do? Like the general population, they lived in what we now call the CBD and were engaged in commerce. Chinese, of course, favoured greengrocers, laundries, import-export, and there was a small group of Chinese restaurant owners who didn't serve Chinese food. It was all Western cooking for Pākehā customers. And as I said, that was the topic of last year's talk. Wakefield Street was actually the first area reported as the place where Chinese businesses and residents grouped, but this very quickly shifted to Greys Avenue, or Grey Street, as it was called until the 1920s. What we know today as Aotea Square was the city produce market from 1872 until 1918. And with the Chinese community so heavily engaged in market gardening and greengrocery, this can be the only explanation for why Chinese liked to be based in this area. However, when the markets were shifted to the viaduct in 1918, Chinatown didn't follow. Greys Avenue was pretty shabby, and the cheap rents were no doubt also a reason for the Chinese community to stay there. Now, when I call Greys Avenue Chinatown, please remember that it was nothing like an American Chinatown. It was at most 2 stores, Wo Li and Sung Yuan, the Chinese Masonic Society meeting rooms, a few restaurants, and a few dozen residents, mostly living in boarding houses owned by Pākehā. A friend of mine recently told me that his grandmother used to talk about Greys Avenue as being full of opium dens. There certainly were one or two places that traded in opium, but it's an urban myth that still exists that the street was overrun with vice and a dangerous place. There were a significant number of Chinese greengrocers and laundries on Victoria Street, Hobson Street and K Road, and there was an informal hostel for out-of-town Chinese on K Road run by Chan Woi Chong. Down the bottom of Quay Street, there was Warjang, which was a significant retail import-export business and hostel and community hub. And out in Stanley Street, Archie's Gardens were also a community hub. So Chinese Aucklanders in this era were all men. If they were married, they'd left their families back in China. And they're traveling into town for business or seeking company on their days off, and restaurants sprang up to cater for them. The first definitive evidence we have for one of these businesses is from 1916. It was a newspaper report of a restaurant at 49 Greys Avenue being busted for gambling. Keep number 49 in mind because it remained a restaurant and some of you might even remember going there. I quote, "With regard to the charges against Joe Guy, some 18 months ago, he opened a Chinese restaurant on the premises. And in course of time, his guests started to play Pakapoo and Fantan amongst themselves. These were practically the only games known to the Chinamen, and probably they were no more harmful to them than European card games were to members of the Northern Club." End quote. In 1918, there was another good example of gambling in a restaurant in Greys Avenue. I quote, "The raided shop, number 29, was ostensibly conducted as a restaurant for Chinese under the sign of the Savoy. In the basement of the building, below the street level, all the paraphernalia peculiar to Chinese games of chance were found. The premises concerned had been under observation for a considerable time, and gambling had been noticed on a number of occasions. Chinamen to the number of about 30 having been present at one time. Yuan, who was charged with being the occupier of the premises, pleaded guilty. Sin Kit said he went to the shop to buy some duck and was speaking to the cook when the police arrived. He was given the benefit of the doubt and discharged. Duck said he was assistant cook and was on the premises just to clean up dishes. He had no money to gamble with. He had been observed by the police earlier in the evening, however, playing a species of gambling patience. And when the raid was made, he was discovered behind a door with his hand over his face." End quote. These articles are the perfect example of how skewed the information on papers past is. Chinese restaurants were only newsworthy if there was a police raid. And of course, the journalists only wanted to sensationalize the opium and gambling. Most of the reports, if they mention the restaurant side of the business, they always seem at pains to point out that these places didn't look like a Pākehā dining room. Instead of Western-style tables for four, set with white tablecloth and cutlery, framed paintings on the wall, and perhaps a sideboard and pot plant tastefully positioned, they found converted front rooms of wooden buildings. The favorite adjectives were dingy or bare. Apart from well-worn Chinese wooden stools and low tables, food or other goods stored in crates against the walls, and a single light bulb from the ceiling. The newspapers frequently reported it was impossible for the establishment to be a restaurant because the kitchen was too simple, or there was no food being served while the men gambled. Pākehā eyes couldn't decipher the rituals of Chinese hospitality. I found an article that describes the etiquette in establishments in San Francisco, but I reckon this helps to explain what was going on in New Zealand. I quote, "It was the custom for gambling dens to provide a dinner every night after the games. Each house kept a good cook for the purpose. Anyone could go in and eat what he wants, but it was not considered lucky for one person to address another and urge him to come to the table. And the meal was usually eaten in silence. All talk about gambling was especially avoided. Also, when several persons were seated at the table and had started eating, it was considered unlucky for another to join the meal." End quote. So in the case of the Savoy, which was the last one I quoted, we've got gambling equipment in the basement, a man buying duck from the cook, and a dishwasher who joined in the gambling. Most of the Chinese in this country around the turn of the 20th century, most of the Chinese restaurants in this country around the turn of the 20th century were probably establishments that sold meals, board, gambling, and opium. I've just found out last week that in Chinese this was called Dai Nan Gorn, which translates as big rest place. To Chinese, meals, board, and gambling and opium combined for a complete hospitality package. The lens of colonial Pākehā morals could not comprehend the blurred lines between a restaurant and a gambling den. And here's a photo of Greys Avenue, Auckland's Chinatown, and a list of the restaurants that we know of. We can't be too certain of the names of the restaurants because these are all sourced from newspapers and street directories printed by Pākehā, who didn't understand the difference between personal names and the names of the business. And as far as spelling, they probably just wrote down what they heard. And these names mean nothing to the Auckland Chinese community today. However, Lynette Shum in Wellington has had a go at making an educated guess and reckons that Dung Tain might mean Eastern Skies, and Hoi Jung could mean Central Ocean or Chinese Ocean. The story of number 59 is quite interesting. It's likely that the people who established it were brothers Jin Ming Long and Jin Ming Hong from Toi San. The older brother, Ming Long, was a trained pastry chef and worked as a cook on a market garden on arrival in Auckland. After Ming Hong's arrival in 1922, they opened a restaurant together, but it was not successful. The family story is that the restaurant failed because Pākehā customers weren't interested in Chinese food. This is the earliest evidence in all of New Zealand I've found of a Chinese restaurant not trying to operate exclusively for Chinese. They moved to Christchurch, where they went into the laundry business, but Ming Long's passion for food meant he always kept noodle making as a sideline. And in the early 1960s, when he was aged 65 and had enough money saved from a quarter of a century in the laundry business, he opened the Shanghai restaurant in Christchurch. This is number 51 Greys Avenue. It was owned by Fong Hong, and it was a restaurant with boarding accommodation upstairs, and it was regularly busted for gambling and opium. But crucially, look at the sign in the window. It's got English writing with the name Nam King and Chop Suey Restaurant. This is the first evidence we have of chop suey being served in New Zealand. I'll run you through the basics of where this dish comes from. There was a Cantonese dish called sap suey, translated roughly as miscellaneous fragments or odds and ends. It would have been a dish considered inferior to the wide range of Cantonese stir-fried dishes, which each consisted of a few carefully selected components and very lightly seasoned. In America, Westerners didn't know or didn't care about the difference and used the name chop suey to describe all stir-fried dishes. By the 1890s, Chinese restaurateurs in the United States realized that their white customers wanted boneless chunks of poultry or fish, fried in batter, and a random jumble of vegetables coated with glossy, viscous sauces, sweet from a heavy hand of sugar and colored rich brown thanks to big doses of soy sauce. Chop suey was born. Thanks to newspapers, soon the whole world knew about chop suey, even in far-flung New Zealand, where it was common for articles from American papers to be reprinted verbatim. The first time the name of the dish appears in papers past is in 1897, and articles from the time portray chop suey with a mixture of bewilderment, revulsion, and fascination. Chow mein, the other icon of Cantonese food altered for Western taste, comes from the Cantonese words chow for stir-fried and mein for fresh wheat noodles. For the original chow mein, the noodles were cooked separately, either boiled or stir-fried before a quick toss with other stir-fried ingredients. Learn Ming Wong, which means double-sided golden brown, which may have actually been Shanghainese in origin, was thin egg noodles, boiled, pressed into a pancake, then shallow fried on both sides until golden and slightly crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. Stir-fried meat or vegetables were then poured over the hot drained noodles. Now, crunchy noodles slowly softening in sauce is awesome, of course, and this became chow mein in America. Early descriptions of chow mein in New Zealand show the American version was imported. In the minds of New Zealanders, chop suey and chow mein were dishes you would find in New York's Chinatown, not China itself. And most importantly, Chinese entrepreneurs have always recognized Westerners' tastes and catered for them. And Auckland's Chinese restaurants did attract Pākehā customers. In this article, the journalist describes his eating adventures off the beaten track, where he found all-night cafes, Dalmatian cafes, self-service cafes, pie carts, a grotty little cafe serving the best tohiroa soup, an Italian chef with a prodigious capacity for cooking, although I'm pretty sure it wasn't actually Italian cuisine in his restaurant in 1931, and Dudley Ong, whose restaurant was most likely at either number 49 or 59 Greys Avenue. Dudley Ong's father, Chan Phuc Ong, arrived in Wellington in 1893. His mother arrived in 1897. Dudley was born in Wellington in 1899. And here's a photo of him. This photo is in his alien registration file. So just take a minute to consider that he was born in New Zealand, but he still had to register as an alien. He probably went to China for school. Dudley Ong probably worked at the large Wajang mercantile firm in the early 20s. He married Auckland-born Ada Lipgui in 1927, and then went into the greengrocery business with 3 others in Newmarket. By 1931, Dudley Ong was running his Greys Avenue restaurant, and he did it until he died in 1939, age 42. I'm pretty sure he and Ada didn't have any children, but they're a still extended family in Auckland, and they go by the surname Chan Ong. Here's what the Herald journalist had to say about Dudley's restaurant. Quote, Dudley is a person of no small charm, a quality which tends to ease one's self-consciousness upon entering the chop suey establishment where he is generally to be found. It is to be understood that the eating house of Dudley is not an entrancing place. It is dimly lit, but that is perfectly in accord with the conventional notion of Chinese quarters. The furnishings are scanty, and persistent drafts harass the venturesome customer. Apart from 1 or 2 ancient calendars in Cantonese, it has one true attraction, and that is quite the most important. It is simply the quality of the meals. In Chinese foodstuffs, there is a sufficiency which has an appeal even to the novice who fumbles awkwardly with chopsticks and ponders on the fascinating mystery of how to mix rich sauce from Peking, it is said, with the remarkable oil, which is an essential part of many Chinese meals. Fried rice, of course, presents no difficulties, but in the absence of a menu, one is tempted to plunge desperately into the hazards of chop suey, long soup, and other dishes which bear hopelessly unintelligible names. Chop suey is a term of remarkable elasticity. The chop suey of Monday evening can conceivably be a meal enticingly different from the chop suey of Tuesday. Long soup looks exactly like spaghetti, but the Chinese would not permit such an easy solution. Not they, it is made of tender bamboo shoots. This, the most interesting of Auckland's eating houses, has a regular clientele. There are men reasonably prominent in the community who have achieved a certain proficiency in using chopsticks and a discrimination in the matter of Oriental foods. End quote. The picture that emerges is one of restaurants serving Cantonese cuisine as well as you could replicate it in New Zealand, with chow mein and chop suey to appeal to European tastes. Quite a few Pākehā dined there for a bit of what we would call today cultural tourism. And as the article about Dudley Ong mentions, undoubtedly some Pākehā customers genuinely enjoyed these restaurants and became regulars. It reminds me of the situation we've had in New Zealand since the 1990s, which this meme sums up nicely. For more than a century, there has been a style of Chinese restaurant which you either like or not. Greys Avenue's Chinese restaurants were known for attracting the artsy Bohemian crowd. They were no doubt trying to enhance their credentials as cosmopolitan avant-garde and maybe a bit risque. One of the best chroniclers of Bohemian life in New Zealand in the 1930s was Robin Hyde, and she dined in Greys Avenue and wrote about it. She opens by excusing her exercise in cultural tourism. The title uses her experience with chopsticks as a metaphor for tolerance. An old Chinese diner spots her clumsiness, approaches her and gently teaches her how to use them. The article is notable for describing some of the finer details of the restaurant, which tended to go unnoticed by less literary journalists. She describes the leaves on the Greys Avenue plane trees, the flowers in front of the shop next door, and once inside the restaurant, the pink-cheeked people painted on the straw-handled teapots from which customers should serve themselves, and the Shanghainese calendar girls on the walls. She describes the only other Pākehā in the restaurant, a redhead who uses chopsticks expertly. Then, unfortunately, she slips into descriptions of the food which were typical for the era, a mixture of disgust and bewilderment, and unfortunately a touch of old-fashioned racism, mocking Chinese accents. The GBS, I'm pretty sure, refers to George Bernard Shaw's vegetarianism, but if anyone is more clued up than me, please let us know. In order to try and analyse the food they served, I'd like to take a step back to consider that authentic Cantonese food was always cooked in New Zealand. When the gold miners arrived, imported ingredients like dried vegetables, dried seafood, and soy sauce arrived almost immediately after them, imported and sold by Chinese merchants. Up until recently, my research has focused on recording names, dates, and addresses, but of course the food served in these restaurants is the most interesting thing for many of us. So here is some fresh analysis I've done on menus. I've not been able to find a single Chinese restaurant menu from before World War II, so I've made up a list from all the paper's past articles. Stir-fried vegetables are essentially the bedrock of Cantonese cuisine, but strangely they are mentioned only once in the restaurant context. Records mention large menus, however the food items named are very limited. Steamed buns filled with pork or sweet bean paste, dim sims, wontons, fried breadsticks, mooncakes, roast or boiled chicken and duck, roast pork, noodles, plain broth, wonton soup, shark fin soup, tea, and Chinese brandy. In Greymouth, there is one record of a rice, lobster, and egg dish. With a supply of fresh Chinese vegetables from Chinese market gardeners and imported ingredients and cooking tools, it would have not been difficult for Cantonese cuisine to survive in these restaurants. Something else worth noting is that things like congee, tofu, and chicken feet made no appearances in the New Zealand evidence. Perhaps they were so baffling to Pākehā observers that they were never written about. And also ingredients like bamboo shoots, water chestnuts, and mushrooms were ubiquitous in North American Chinese restaurant menus. They did make an appearance in Australian Chinese restaurants, but the quote I gave you earlier from Dudley Ong's restaurant is the only mention in New Zealand of bamboo shoots. The writer knew they were in the dish, but had trouble identifying them. The presence of what we would call today street food style items, like steamed buns and fried bread, helped to prove the New Zealand restaurant's main customer base was Chinese. And also these are all things we would totally recognize today. I have evidence from a few Chinese New Zealanders who remember the 1940s and 50s that in their experience, a trip to town and a stop at the Chinese restaurant always meant noodle soup. You'll notice that this menu is pretty heavy on wheat-based dishes, while rice-based dishes were what Chinese New Zealanders ate at home. I haven't yet come up with a solid explanation for this, but one thing is that in Cantonese tradition, noodle soup is a snack, not a meal. Also, as a cook myself, it's easy to surmise that noodles, wontons, and soup stock are things that are difficult to prepare or take time. Same for roast pork, which in the Chinese community was almost always prepared commercially by an expert. Chinese restaurants in this era made their own noodles, the old-fashioned way, with a kneading apparatus like this, where a bamboo pole is attached by a string to the bench and the cook hitches his leg over and bounces up and down, maneuvering the pole back and forth across the dough. By 1929, a restaurant in Greys Avenue, officially known as Luk Hau Yon, was placing newspaper ads declaring itself the best chop suey house in New Zealand. It's not known who owned or operated the Luk Hau Yon until 1940, when the first record of Ng Kwong Ming and his wife Wong Bu Kum as proprietors exists. I've caught up with 3 of their children who have given me quite a lot of information about how the restaurant was run. Kwong Ming arrived in New Zealand in 1925 and paid the poll tax. His children really don't know much about his life before they were school age, but they think he started off working in market gardens, but following a medical event, had to do lighter work and could have got jobs through the Chinese community, of course, in fruit shops or as a kitchen hand. After the Japanese invasion of Guangdong, Kwong Ming sent money for Wong Bu Kum to go to Hong Kong, and she came to New Zealand in January 1940 after the government decided they would allow families of Chinese residents to come here. In 1943, they renamed the cafe the Golden Dragon. It was in a 2-storied Victorian-era block of shops. The day would start with Kwong Ming going to the wholesale market and Bu Kum overseeing waitress arrival, bread buttering, coffee, brewing, and the start of pork bone soup stock, ready for 11 a.m. opening. Pre-midday trade was quiet. In the basement, there was a storage area where trucks could make deliveries and a food prep area. They employed 2 chefs. Hong Mok worked downstairs, preparing vegetables, cooking large pots of white rice, kneading the dough in the traditional way I showed you, and apparently the pole used at the Golden Dragon might have been an old ship's mast. Breaking down whole sides of pork, killing live chickens, poaching them, and preparing Chinese dinner for family and Chinese staff, which was served after the rush hour. Upstairs, in the kitchen proper, a cook named Bing Hu started in the morning preparing and roasting chicken and pork. He and Kwong Ming had a total of 8 gas burners, each dedicated to its own speciality. Pork bone stock, boiling water to cook wontons, noodles, and suey gao dumplings, egg fried rice, chop suey, sweet and sour dishes, egg foo young, and steaks, and hot lard for deep frying. Pākehā customers liked their vegetables soft, and the Golden Dragon solution was to have 2 very large woks filled with pork pieces and stock, into which went the vegetables for chop suey, and the lid put on and boiled until ready. Another secret touch was that for extra crispy chow mein noodles, the freshly cut noodle pastry went straight into the deep fryer, no pre-boiling. From the street, the cafe entrance led into the dining room, comprised of cubicles on both sides of the room and oblong tables for 4 in the middle. Later on, they also leased the ground floor of the next shop and knocked through so the dining room could be expanded at peak times. Some of you who ate at the Golden Dragon may remember something unusual for a Chinese restaurant. Coin-operated jukeboxes were installed into the cubicles where diners could choose their own music. These were run on a franchise system where the jukeboxes and records were owned by an outside company who came in and maintained the jukeboxes and cleared the money. Each table had soy sauce, salt, pepper, and sugar. The first thing a waitress would do was deliver a plate with 2 slices of buttered bread, cutlery, and paper napkins. The children remember the restaurant as being hectic, a queue waiting to get into the cafe and cooked food running out, with delays until the next wok was ready. Also running out of serving dishes as plates were not returning fast enough to be washed, sterilized, and ready for the next customer. They employed a Māori woman to help with washing the dishes during the busy period. And thanks to the social media promotion of this talk today, I may have made touch with that woman's daughter. So as a historian, it's absolutely amazing to be able to record the name of the dishwasher at the Golden Dragon. There was 1 full-time waitress who had a morning start and part-timers to help in the rushes at dinner time and at 6 o'clock closing. The children remember fondly a Dalmatian waitress named Maria, who after the Golden Dragon closed in 1965, opened her own hair salon in one of the Civics shops in Wellesley Street West. Life pretty much revolved around the cafe as it opened every day except a half Christmas day, followed by Christmas lunch for staff and family. Bu Kum had to do household chores late evenings or early mornings. This menu has no Western food on it. The children think in the early days, the main customer base was Chinese, but as it gradually became more popular, there would be requests for European food, grills like steak, roast pork, or chicken with chips, eggs, or salad. The children remember the restaurant was popular with Māori who came from up north for rugby matches, and they caused stress in the kitchen when a big group was in, with each guy ordering 2 steaks and 6 or more eggs at a time. Now, this is a good point to discuss Kwong Ming's skill as a chef. His children think he was self-taught, and like for many other self-taught restaurateurs around New Zealand, cooking chop suey and chow mein was not rocket science. However, Kwong Ming also cooked Chinese banquets with dishes such as shark fin soup, bird's nest soup, handmade fish balls, black fungus, dried Chinese mushrooms, and dried shrimp, squid, octopus, and sea slugs. The Chinese he catered for were from his generation, immigrants who appreciated his dishes for birthdays, weddings, and when Chinese opera singers were touring New Zealand. The freshly roasted meats were very popular with local Chinese families. They would use the pork products for dinner or to make char siu pork steamed baos. There was one occasion with a group of Pākehā diners who wanted authentic Chinese food, which they had enjoyed in Hong Kong. They were given a private dining experience in the second dining room. The one story I hear over and over from people who remember the Golden Dragon is going with your own pots to get takeaways. The children remember that they tended to be over generous in the portions they gave for takeaways, and that the customers got wise and took advantage of this. And apparently they catered for the Beatles, but they had to deliver to the town hall stage door and weren't allowed in to meet the group. The children remember their father as a quiet man, very kind and generous. With a happy disposition and friendly manner, he mixed easily with people. He was maybe too trusting, so people could take advantage of him at times. Bu Kum's biggest life challenge was the untimely death of Kwong Ming in 1964, aged 61. The children remember Bu Kum as a very loving mother. She was small in stature, under 5 feet, but strong mentally and physically. She always seemed to have energy and positivity and never looked worn down from her daily workload. She was the powerhouse running the cafe, gradually picking up enough English to manage staff and customers. She was illiterate, but she used common sense and asked the necessary questions. If you were a regular at the restaurant, you might have known her as Ma Ming. At the age of about 70, she managed to get a temporary part-time job folding ties into packets for Parisian ties. A Chinese friend working there already recruited her. After Kwong Ming's death, Bu Kum and son Bill kept the cafe open for the next few months. Then in mid-1965, they were informed the Auckland City Council would be taking all the Chinatown buildings for the formation of Aotea Square. After the Golden Dragon Cafe closed, Bu Kum and Bill did search for other premises, but this never eventuated. Bill went on to own cafes and lunch bars in Mount Eden, Otahuhu, Hunter's Corner, and Penrose. So note that it was 1943 when the Lak Hau Yon was renamed the Golden Dragon, probably the most stereotypical Chinatown restaurant name you can think of. There is no actual documentary evidence, but it's pretty safe to assume that the restaurant was popular with American GIs. Then in 1944, across the road from the Golden Dragon, William Du and his brothers opened a brand new restaurant called the Chunking Café Deluxe. So in this photo, we have on the right Ng Kwong Ming of the Golden Dragon, standing outside his restaurant with George Jin in the middle, owner of the building, who also had his Worley mercantile business next door, and William Du. The Dus were well-known and influential Auckland merchants. They imported and exported merchandise between China and Gold Mountain countries. As early Chinese community leaders, their stores had multiple functions, including immigration, consulting, banking, mailing, and social gathering. Family law says that during the war, the halt of imported goods from China made it hard to run traditional Chinese merchant stores, so the Du family began diversifying their businesses. What they did was take a Victorian-era brick warehouse and convert it into a restaurant. With the help of Owen Gordon from the Auckland Council Archives, I found the architect's plans for the restaurant construction, and aren't they magnificent? This is the first Chinese restaurant in New Zealand to have pagoda roofs. Now, remember how I told you to take note of that image of American Chinatowns earlier? So, after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, what happened was that Chinese merchants hired American architects to rebuild. adding colourful pagoda-style curled eaves and dragon motifs on top, and decorative arches on the street level. Many North American Chinatowns followed suit. It was a strategy specifically to create a form of exotic streetscape, yet safe enough to attract white visitors to Chinatown. Here are a few more examples. The ex and soon to be demolished He's Garden on Mount Eden Road. And on the Royal Oak Roundabout, add some curled eaves to a KFC, paint it red and green, and you've got the royal cuisine. But if you think about it, pagoda roof Chinese restaurants are actually very rare in New Zealand. So here's the advertisement for the opening of the Chung King. So you've got them drawing attention to the dishes that Westerners know and like. There's a heavy emphasis on mid-century ideas of good nutrition and the quality and class of the establishment. There was also a version of this ad, which unfortunately was too poorly reproduced on papers passed to include today, but I've included just in the red section there. It says the Chung King was on a par with the biggest name Chinatown restaurants overseas. My interpretation was that the dudes were opening a Chinatown restaurant specifically to appeal to Pākehā. And then you've got this line here. When plans were drawn up for the cafe, it was for Chinese only. But now we are opening it to opening, we find that our people have numerous European friends. So I thought this was just a bit of clever marketing. But I've talked to quite a few people who remember the Chung King as being mostly popular with Chinese Aucklanders, not so much with Pākehā. Here's the thing as far as I'm concerned. The dues had the money to invest, even in the middle of the supposed upheaval and tough times of World War II, and their importing and exporting business meant they had connections all over the Pacific Rim. They knew that Westerners' tastes were changing and that Chinese food was becoming fashionable. After 2 years of trying, I've finally made contact with some members of the Du family who were close to the brothers who ran the restaurant, and I might be able to get a few more stories. I also have some leads for some more good photos, but you'll have to buy my book to see those. There was one more Chinese restaurant that opened on Greys Avenue in about 1953, the Gurm Learn. It was at 65 Greys Avenue, and established by former laundry owners Fong Ngai Jing, his wife Fong Wong Shi, and one of Ngai Jing's brothers. This is a photo of daughters Rose and Marie. Of course, the children helped run the business. And it gives you some idea of what the decor was like. When the restaurant opened, it attempted yum cha style morning tea. There was a pastry cook who made gaoji dumplings and bao steamed buns with roast pork or sweet black bean paste, and another chef who specialized in fresh noodles and wonton pastry. The yum cha concept didn't last long as the turnover was not high enough. Yet another example of Pākehā not being ready yet for real Chinese food. Fong Ngai Jing worked until his death in 1958, and the restaurant eventually became the Sputnik Café. The Chung King also survived until the late 1960s when the city council demolished it for car parking. So, I reckon at the end of my talk, about half of us are going to be going out for Chinese food. The BBQ Duck around the corner on Rutland Street is the nearest Cantonese restaurant. And the other half of us are going to go straight to Greys Avenue and have a look. So to help orientate you, I've used the old 1908 city map of Auckland. So this, I've marked here in yellow, this corner here of the town hall still exists. So you can actually stand on that corner and then orientate where all the different places were. This black line here is where Merrill Drive is approximately now. So at number 29, we have the Savoy. Number 71 was a restaurant in the 20s and 30s, but I haven't really found any details about it. Number 65 was the Gurm Learn. Number 59 was the restaurant that changed hands frequently in the 20s and 30s. 51 was Nam King, 49 was Golden Dragon, and 26 was Chung King. And here's what it looked like in 1928. You recognize the town hall, of course. And then on the right of the picture is the Market Hotel, which was on the corner of Cook Street, running off to the right there. Chinatown would have been where the trees start. And by the way, those trees have survived all the demolition. Okay, now briefly on to some of the next generation. This man with the glasses is Frank Young, who established the Hong Kong. The photo was posted on Helen Wong's excellent New Zealand Chinese Facebook page by Frank's granddaughter, Kayleen Young. I highly recommend you keep an eye on the Facebook page. In 1956, Jin Ming Wood and Stanley Yi Young left the laundry business and bought the Green Parrot Cafe at 8 Derby Street. It was a going concern selling fish and chips, sausages, oysters, and mixed grills. They ran it as such for a while and then renamed it Ming's and started serving chop sueys and chow mains. But as was to become the norm, they kept serving the European menu too. Now, I could probably start a family tree showing how ex-employees spread out from Ming's to open their own restaurants and takeaways, and then employees from those establishments did the same, and so on. I'm giving you the names of the male heads of the family, but of course it was the whole family and sometimes extended family who ran each restaurant. Stanley Yi Young set up the Peking Café in 1960. In the late 60s and early 70s, it was apparently owned by Pākehā. And then by 1978, it was bought by Arthur Fong from a Pukekohe market gardening background, who owned it at the time this photo was taken. The Tai Tung raised the bar a bit. The restaurant reviewer Peter Calder once shared his memories of this restaurant. Quote, "As an indigent university student, I would occasionally treat myself to dinner in the dirt cheap Kam Sang in the then borderline squalid part of Queen Street opposite the town hall. But the Tai Tung in snazzy Swanson Street was of a different order altogether. Lured there one night by better-heeled law students, I broke into a cold sweat at the sight of the menu. The combination fried rice was, if I remember rightly, 40 cents instead of the 25 cents I was accustomed to." End quote. The Tai Tung was started in 1963 by Stanley Yi Young, but then would be taken over by George Wong. Stanley's son, Kevin Yi Young, would go on to open the Hua Sky restaurant in Papakura. And when George Wong needed a break from the business, he leased the Tai Tung to the Ing family, who already had a background in restaurants in Rotorua, and would go on to run takeaways in Kohimarama, St Heliers, Newmarket, and a Thai restaurant in Kaiba Pass Road. The Mandarin was established by Peter Lorgun, formerly of Ming's, and his extended family. I haven't been able to figure out when it opened because they were never listed in the phone book. In 1977, it was bought by the Youngs and the Chungs, ex-greengrocers. It was licensed, and as you can see, or maybe not because the text is still a little bit too small, it had a pretty sophisticated menu. And the second owner, Kitty Young, told me there was a maitre d' called Tony Wong, who'd come from big Western hotel chains and was a great asset to the restaurant. It was a particular favorite for long-lunching businessmen, but by the early 80s struggled to keep up with the competition. The Youngs sold it on in 1982, and by 1987, it was called the Sichuan Restaurant. The Orient, underground at the Elliott Street end of the Strand Arcade, was established in 1971 by Ray Ming, son of Jin Ming Wood of Ming's. Ray, of course, had cut his teeth in his father's business and went all out with decor, service, wine list, and live music to make this a truly high-class establishment. And as you can see from the menu, a big departure from chop suey and chow mein. Many chefs passed through the Orient and the renamed New Orient after Ray Ming sold it to establish their own businesses. The Wun Loy. This tiny 10-table storefront restaurant was particularly popular with market gardeners after they'd finished at the viaduct auctions, ostensibly because they could just drive up and it was easy to park their trucks. But no doubt the good company was an important drawcard. It was established in 1969 by Wong Heung and wife Yuk Wun. A few years later, it was taken over by Ming Lee, who ran it until 2006. So that's the end of my talk. All this is going to be published as a book, hopefully in 2025. I've concentrated on the Auckland scene today because this talk is hosted by Auckland Libraries. But for those of you on Zoom, I am researching the whole country. So I need feedback, leads, photos, old menus. All will be gratefully received. And I want you to email me your information so I can cite you. Thank you very much.